agriculture from the EPA's overreach. This bill will prevent the EPA from running wild across America's farms and subjecting our producers to more burdensome regulations and threaten to put them out of business. Rural America has never stopped being a good place to live, so it's our job to make sure it's a good place to make a living, too. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank my friend from California for his leadership. I rise today in opposition to H.R. 910. My friend, Mr. Blumenauer, made the point that there's a deliberate misleading title to this bill to somehow allow cynically voters to believe that this is about taxes. And I think, and I had an amendment before the Rules Committee that unfortunately was not accepted, how about we be intellectually honest about this? Let's rename the bill the Koch brothers Appreciation Act of 2011. At least then we could clear the air and be honest. But then again, that's what this bill is all about, not clearing the air, but ensuring that it stays polluted. Today, sadly, the other party will attempt to pass a bill that denies decades of science in order to protect the profits of a few favored corporations. Next, we may hear that the claims that the Earth indeed is flat. When Congress passed the Clean Air Act in 1970, it directed the EPA to protect public health and welfare from pollution that would alter weather and climate 40 years ago. In the last 40 years, hundreds peer-reviewed scientific papers have found global warming is caused by humans, is becoming worse, and poses a dire threat to our public health, national security, and economic vitality. This bill makes Congress the final arbiter of science. That is a perilous path, Mr. Chairman, to go down, and it repudiates 100 years of bipartisan efforts to craft public health legislation according to science. Not since the Scopes trial has a division of government waged such an outlandish assault on science. With H.R. 910, Republicans sadly have aligned themselves with that school board in Tennessee and with the Pope who excommunicated Galileo. I yield back my time to the distinguished ranking minority member of the Energy and Commerce Committee.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this point, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Goodlatte.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman for yielding me the time and for his leadership on this issue, and I rise in strong support of this legislation. Despite President Obama stating that he would prefer Congress to take the lead in determining how to handle greenhouse gases, what do you know? The Environmental Protection Agency has begun their own plan to regulate greenhouse gases. American voters spoke in November, and they clearly rejected the cap-and-trade agenda that was offered in this Congress last year, not taken up in the United States Senate. Now we're faced with the need to act ourselves. So unless the Congress acts to stop the EPA, this administration and the Environmental Protection Agency will enact their own cap-and-trade-like agenda. Without action, the EPA will add more regulatory red tape on American businesses and manufacturers, hampering the ability of companies to operate competitively in the United States. These businesses could be forced to move those jobs overseas to locations with fewer regulatory burdens, or simply pass these increased costs on to American consumers. Either choice is not good for jobs in America. Without action, these regulations will be paid by anyone who turns on a light switch or plugs in an appliance. We must stop the EPA from continuing their spree of over-regulating our economy. During this economic slowdown, we should be adopting policies that seek to rebuild our economy, create more jobs. We should be producing more energy, and all of the above energy plan that I know the Energy and Commerce Committee is working on to increase domestic production of oil and natural gas and coal and safe nuclear power, and encourage new productions from new sources of energy. But let's make America energy independent. Let's not raise the cost of energy and ship jobs overseas and cost millions of American jobs. We should be doing just the opposite. This legislation starts us on that path, and I urge my colleagues to support it.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, may I inquire how much time is on each side?
Gentleman has 10 minutes remaining.
And the other side?
Gentleman from Michigan has 11 and 1/2 minutes remaining.
He has how many?
11 and 1/2.
We have 2 minutes?
10.
10 minutes, and they have 11.
1-0. Yes, sir.
I'm going to reserve our time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield at this point 1 minute to the gentleman from Oklahoma, co-sponsor of the bill, Mr. Boren. 1 minute.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 1 minute.
Support of Chairman Upton's bill, H.R. 910, a bill to prevent the EPA from regulating greenhouse gases. By passing this bill, Congress will rein in the EPA and save thousands of American jobs. This is a very sensitive issue to me. Georgia Pacific, a subsidiary of Koch Industries, is the largest employer in my hometown of Muskogee, Oklahoma, employing almost 1,000 Oklahomans. I'm proud of the work Koch Industries brings to my district and its record of environmental stewardship. I want to make sure that Georgia Pacific employees keep their jobs and that Koch can continue to invest in Oklahoma. Every member of Congress understands the delicate balance between creating jobs and preserving the environment. But I ask my colleagues to see that the answer to America's economic and environmental challenges is not a more powerful EPA. Let's pass the Upton bill and put an end to this job-killing idea. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from California. Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Minnesota, the former chairman of the House Ag Committee and now ranking member of that committee, Mr. Peterson. 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of H.R. 910, and we recently held a hearing in the Agriculture Committee with the folks from the EPA and the message, and from people in agriculture, and the message that we heard was pretty clear from agriculture that they believe the EPA needs to be reined in, not only as regards this bill, but other measures that are being considered within the EPA as well. What this bill will do, it hit a pause button, you know, on the EPA's current efforts to regulate greenhouse gases, and that's exactly what people in agriculture think we need. You know, I've traveled the country, all over the country, talking to agriculture producers, both, you know, in my district and other places, and they're concerned about what they see coming out of this agency, the regulations that they're seeing, and what really concerns them is that the agency does not seem to understand agriculture, and frankly doesn't seem to want to understand agriculture. These proposed regulations we're seeing from EPA could potentially get in the way of what agriculture producers are already doing when it comes to conservation of our natural resources. American farmers and ranchers rely on these resources to provide the world's food supply and are committed to preserving them for the next generation. The EPA claims to be operating in an open and transparent manner, but the agency is sending mixed messages. At the recent hearing that I mentioned earlier, we were told that agriculture is currently exempt from proposed regulations, yet press reports have quoted the administrator since as saying that the EPA will begin looking at regulating greenhouse gases from farms as soon as 2013. If Congress doesn't do something about the regulations being imposed on our farmers, ranchers, and rural communities, the economic effects are going to affect everybody in America. We're being asked to feed more and more people, not only in this country, but around the world. And this kind of legislation, the effect is going to be to make it harder to do that and also to raise the cost on all of the consumers in this country at a time when that's the last thing that we need. So I encourage my colleagues to support H.R. 910 and yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, I thank my colleague from California. For 40 years, the Clean Air Act has been successful in reducing emissions in the atmosphere, pollution that kills people. Thousands of people are alive today because of the Clean Air Act. None of them know who they are. It might be people in this chamber, some of us. And the success of the Clean Air Bill is due in large part to being enacted and strengthened based on the best science available to find effective ways to remove the worst pollutants from our air. The legislation before us today, appropriately nicknamed the Dirty Air Act, would gut the Clean Air Act and prevent EPA scientists from doing their jobs. The Clean Air Act was written wisely to allow the safeguards to grow with the scientific understanding of the dangers proposed by various chemicals in the air and with the technological means for controlling those pollutants. Carbon pollution a couple of years ago was determined by EPA scientists to endanger the health and welfare of the American people. EPA scientists should be allowed to continue their work. Air pollution is costly in lives and in dollars. The Clean Air Act is successful. The legislation must be protected.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, might I just inquire on the time on remaining on both sides again, please?
Gentleman from Michigan has 8 1/2 minutes remaining. Gentleman from California has 9 minutes remaining.
You have 9, I've got 8.5.
What were the times again?
9,
Gentleman
8
from
and a half.
California has 9 minutes. Gentleman from Michigan has 8 1/2 minutes.
Okay. Why don't you go ahead? We're going to reserve the balance of our
I
time.
saw Steny over there, so I thought, okay.
Gentleman
Thank
from
you,
Michigan.
Mr. Chairman. I would yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from West Virginia, Ms. Capito.
Gentlelady from West Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of H.R. 910, the Energy Tax Prevention Act, which would prohibit the EPA from using the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases. Congress has already said no to a cap-and-trade tax, yet the EPA is intent on taking matters into their own hands, which will result in a bleeding of jobs. If the EPA is allowed to continue to pick winners and losers in this country, we will be seeing higher prices at the gas pump, higher utility bills, and job loss. We should be making it easier, not harder, for small businesses to expand and hire. However, the EPA's assault on fossil fuels will result in higher domestic energy costs and push American jobs overseas. At home in West Virginia, the EPA is making it much more expensive to turn on our lights, drive to work, and that's not the way to get our economy back on track. This legislation is of particular importance to my constituents in West Virginia. The EPA's regulations will disproportionately affect our state's economy. West Virginia powers the nation. Our energy providers provide thousands of good-paying jobs, and coal alone provides 1/2 of our nation's electricity and over 95% of the power in my state. I strongly urge my colleagues to vote in favor of H.R. 910 to stop the EPA's regulatory overreach and job-killing strategies.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
I want to clarify some statements that have been made that are absolutely inaccurate. There may be members who are unhappy about EPA regulations as they hear from their constituents, but that's not what's involved in this bill today. This bill would stop EPA from regulating as it relates to carbon emissions. And EPA has undertaken this because of a scientific finding that carbon emissions are causing a danger to public health and the environment. EPA, under the Clean Air Act, has a wide range of possible regulations, but EPA has decided that they would restrict their regulations only to new sources or expansion of existing sources of large polluters of 100,000 tons per year. And that is all. Yield myself another 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for initial 30 seconds.
So we've heard these claims that they're going to come in and regulate areas where they're not seeking to regulate, nor would they, in fact, do it. That's the new sources. 100,000 tons of pollution is equivalent to burning a trainload of coal per day. We hear people from the coal-burning states. They're not threatened unless there are new sources of that magnitude. The oil companies are not going to be regulated unless they're going to have a new source of that magnitude. Maybe they're fearful about other regulation, but that's no reason to support this bill.
Gentleman's time
Reserve
has expired.
my time.
Gentleman from Michigan.
I would yield a minute to the chairman of the Energy and Power Subcommittee, Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. On this tailoring rule that was adopted by EPA, saying that they would regulate only those emitters of 100,000 tons per more per year, that's in direct violation of the language of the Clean Air Act, which says they have to regulate anything 150 to 250 tons per year. And lawsuits have already been filed against the EPA of violating the Clean Air Act, and there is a strong sense that the Tailoring Act would be ruled illegal, and if it is, as Gina McCarthy said, they would have to regulate everything in society, including small farms, small businesses, everyone. They do not have the manpower to do it, and as she stated, it would take the enforcing agencies alone it would cost them $24 billion, and that's not including the money that industries and others would have to spend to comply with the new regulations. So this statement that they will not be impacted is certainly not settled.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself an additional minute.
Gentleman is
I want to
recognized for 1
refute
minute.
the statements that have just been made. There's a court-tested approval of EPA to design regulations that are tailored to certain problems, and they need not have to go beyond that. The complaints on the other side is that there's a wide-ranging regulation, but there's not. And there will be an amendment offered by Representative Kind and Owens to restrict in law that a regulation to what the EPA is proposing. And I hope the gentleman that spoke just now will vote for that amendment. Whether it passes or not, EPA can design its regulation, and they ought not to complain about a regulation that's not being proposed. They don't want even the minimal one that EPA is proposing. If we don't legislate and we don't regulate, we are ignoring the problem, and we're going to make it much, much worse and costlier to correct later on. Reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this point, I'll yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Hampshire, Mr. Bass, a member of the committee.
New Hampshire is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of this legislation. For me, this debate is not about whether or not climate change is occurring. It's about preventing nor is it about preventing the congressionally directed policies that Congress should have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and allow us to have a low-carbon producing economy. I, for one, think that climate change is real and a problem that needs to be addressed with practical solutions that have attainable goals to reduce emissions and provide certainty in our economy. I also believe that the Clean Air Act has truly benefited our nation and should never be weakened, rather strengthened. However, agencies should not be able to regulate what has not been legislated. Doing so does not solve problems. It creates even more uncertainty as it opens up the agency's rules to countless legal challenges. And I am committed to finding a workable solution to achieve clean air, help address global warming, and preserve the economic competitiveness of the United States in the global marketplace. With my friend, Congressman Matheson of Utah, we offered an amendment during markup that is now in the bill that states that there is established scientific concern over warming of the climate system, and Congress should fulfill its role in developing policies to control greenhouse gas emissions. I rise in support of this legislation, but I also support a meaningful solution to the carbon crisis.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased at this time to yield to the Democratic whip in the House, Mr. Hoyer, 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes. 3 minutes.
Briefly, in response to the gentleman's assertion, of course, the court has said EPA does, in fact, have this authority. This is not a new authority they're making up. Rather than invest in new energy technologies, address carbon pollution, and create clean energy jobs, our friend on the other side are choosing instead to deny the problem and take away America's tools for responding to it. This bill would overturn auto emission standards that are making our cars and trucks cheaper to drive and breaking our independence on foreign oil. This bill would not do a single thing to bring down the price of gas, but it would keep America from saving 1.8 billion barrels of oil over the lifetime of our new cars. We would not have gotten there, frankly, if some of the proponents of this bill who opposed getting to those standards had prevailed. And it would do so at a time when the turmoil in the Middle East should serve as an energy independence wake-up call. I'm for using all of our energy that we can do so in a healthy, safe way. This bill, however, would significantly weaken the Clean Air Act over its 40-year span. The benefits of the Act, longer lives, healthier kids, greater workforce productivity, and protected ecosystems have outweighed the cost by more than 30 to 1. That's a pretty good return, ladies and gentlemen. Last year, according to the EPA, just one part of the Clean Air Act prevented some 160,000 premature deaths, 130,000 heart attacks, and 100,000 hospital visits. That is a pretty good return on our investment. And according to the American Medical Association, quote, if physicians want evidence of climate change, they may well find it in their own offices. Patients are presenting with illnesses that once happened only in warmer areas. Chronic conditions are becoming aggravated by more frequent and extended heat waves. Allergy and asthma seasons are getting longer. The gentleman from New Hampshire said he doesn't doubt global warming. I agree with that conclusion. It's a shame this bill doesn't take that perspective. The Republican response is to make pollution easier, frankly. And finally, this bill overturns scientific findings that carbon pollution endangers the environment and human health, which has been confirmed by all of the world's leading scientists. A partisan majority can pass whatever bill it wants, I understand that, but it cannot legislate the facts out of existence. Facts that as recently as a few years ago were accepted in both parties. What changed? The science or the politics? Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, which recklessly endangers our air, our health, our climate, and our energy independence, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, I would yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy, a member of the committee.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Okay, here we go. When we discuss the cap-and-trade bill, it works sort of like the Seinfeld show. George Costanza comes to Jerry and says, you know what we should do with this show, what it should be about? Jerry says, what? George says, it's about nothing. Here's how cap-and-trade works. Factory A has something coming out of its smokestack. Factory B doesn't. So Factory B sells their nothing to Factory A. Factory A adds that cost to the cost of their products. Sooner or later, they raise costs of electricity, raise costs of their products. They can't make it in America anymore. America figured this out long ago, and they said, we're going to see energy prices go up. We're going to see jobs and income go down. We don't want it to work this way. We want clean air, clean land, and clean water, but the way these things are working is not what's going to make it happen. And so the American people say, don't export our jobs, don't export our factories, don't export our manufacturing, and then end up importing emissions from other countries. It's a global problem. It's something we have to deal with, but having the EPA do this without working through Congress isn't the way to make this happen. Let's come up with a real solution here, but not continue on down this road of exporting our jobs to other countries. And I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California.
Continue to reserve the time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, if I might just enter with a brief colloquy with my friend, the gentleman from California. We have each of us has about the same amount of time left. We've allocated our time. I presume you have as well. Our remaining speakers are someplace meeting, and I'm prepared to close and yield back if you are, unless somebody comes to the floor awfully fast. Is it the same for you?
I find myself in the same position. We're prepared to close and yield back our time, unless one of our members shows up unexpectedly.
Fine.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, I have before me a letter from the United States Environmental Protection Agency. We asked them very specific questions, and one was whether this would establish a backdoor cap-and-trade program. They said, 1, EPA has not adopted a cap-and-trade program to address greenhouse gas emissions. 2, EPA is not considering or evaluating a cap-and-trade program to address these emissions under existing Clean Air Act authority. And they further went on to say they do not anticipate that they will do a cap-and-trade program. none of the 5 programs that they have adopted is considering adopting to limit harmful pollution or cap-and-trade programs. So when we hear members get up and say, oh, they're about to adopt a cap-and-trade program because Jerry Seinfeld's show might lead you to that conclusion, it is not, according to Lisa Jackson, the head of EPA, their intent. EPA, under the law, is required to look at the science. Once they determined that carbon is a pollution that causes harm to public health and the environment, they must decide to regulate. They could, under their powers, fashion the regulation in a modest way, which is exactly what they've done. The regulations that they have proposed can be met through greater efficiency in these new sources that would emit such large amounts of carbon. That is a reasonable thing to do because it is beneficial for the industries to be more efficient. We have found over the years under the Clean Air Act when sources of pollution, industries, reduce their pollution, they become more efficient and more competitive. That's what will happen as a result of the regulations that are being proposed. Let us not tie EPA's hands and say they cannot deal with this subject. For those who deny the science, I disagree with you. But if you're wrong, it will take a long time before any strategy will come into effect to reduce these emissions. Buy at least an insurance policy to reduce these dangerous pollution so that we can avoid some of the terrible consequences of greenhouse gas emissions and the climate change which is already evident in this country and around the world. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill. Vote no.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, we followed regular order on this bill. We had plenty of hearings. We issued a discussion draft. We had markups in both full and the subcommittee. We sought bipartisan support. In fact, we received it. Mr. Peterson, who spoke earlier, the former chairman of the House Ag Committee, Mr. Ray Hall, the former chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, are both original co-sponsors. We have different rules than the other body, the Senate. They're debating this same issue today. In fact, they've been debating it now for a couple of weeks. And it's interesting to me that a number of the amendments on the amendment tree in the Senate by different Democratic sponsors, in fact, I would say confess that the EPA is run amok because they too, though they might not be fully supportive of this legislation, they too are supporting a 2-year timeout to the EPA to tell them to stop. They're not ready for this. I voted for the Clean Air Act back in 1990, and I think most of my colleagues then, it was a strong majority that supported that. It allows the EPA to regulate 188 different contaminants. They do that. This bill does not weaken that work by the EPA. There was an issue then that the Senate included in their version of the bill that did regulate greenhouse gases. And when it went to conference with the House, John Dingell was then chairman of the conference committee. The House did not accept the Senate language. The Senate receded to the House, as the lingo goes, and in fact the Clean Air Act then ended up without regulating greenhouse gases. We had a huge debate in the last Congress on cap and trade. Speaker Pelosi had a 86-vote margin here in the House. Cap and trade, yes, it did pass in the House. It passed by 7 votes. So you switch 4 votes, it goes the other way. But despite that passage in June of 2009, the Senate did not take that legislation up. Didn't go through subcommittee, full committee, never got to the Senate floor, and it died with the conclusion of the 110th Congress. What we're saying is that the Congress, elected leaders here, should decide what is regulated. We know that from the testimony that we had in committee, we may lose as many as 1.5 million jobs. We heard from the refineries. They know that it's going to increase costs because they're going to have additional regulation. They're going to pass those costs on, and in fact, it will raise the price of gasoline by 20 to 50 cents over the next number of years. That's not what we want to see in this country. And what's going to happen? What's going to happen to those jobs? They're going to leave this country, and they're not going to come back, and they're going to go to other places like, let's face it, India and China, which have, neither country has nearly the environmental laws that we have today. We are going to continue to see the Clean Air Act enforced. This does not weaken that act. We just say we're not ready to regulate greenhouse gases. Not when we have an unemployment rate where it is today, Michigan much higher than the national average, knowing that it's going to cost a lot of jobs. So I would urge my colleagues to support this legislation. It tells the EPA, no, you're not going to do this. We'll see what happens with the Senate as they debate this issue the rest of the day and perhaps into tomorrow. But I would urge all of my colleagues to support H.R. 910, particularly now as we get into the amendments. And, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the amendment in the nature of a substitute printed in the bill shall be considered as an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule and shall be considered read. No amendment to the committee amendment is in order except those printed in House Report 11254. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report by a member designated in the report. Shall be considered read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider amendment number 1, printed in House Report 11254. For what purpose does a gentleman or gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
Have amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in House Report number 112-54, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 203, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes gentlewoman from Texas.
I thank the distinguished chair very much, and I want to thank the ranking member of the full committee for reading a very important letter into the record that the EPA has no intention to manipulate or to utilize cap-and-trade as part of their responsibilities. This is not a cap-and-trade initiative or legislation. It has nothing to do with cap-and-trade. In fact, I think the whole concept of this Energy Tax Prevention Act is muddled and befuddled. I don't understand it. I've practiced oil and gas law for almost 15 or 20 years. I come from Houston, and I recognize the difficulties that we have in the industry and understanding the industry, but I also am cognizant that this majority, my good friend on the other side, represents that they are interested in adhering to the Constitution. And I don't know why they have not studied the Supreme Court decision in Massachusetts versus EPA that clearly indicates, even though this was motor vehicle emissions that they were talking about, but it held that greenhouse gases, widely viewed as contributing to climate change, constitute air pollutants. And therefore, that phrase is utilized under the Clean Air Act, and the EPA has jurisdiction to regulate under the Clean Air Act. I assume what we're doing is trying to bash a long-standing process rather than coming up with better ideas. I think my amendment brings about a better idea because energy is a national security issue. And what my amendment poses to do is to ask serious questions about the impact of eliminating the EPA authority, finding a way to work through this question. What would be the long-term impact? Because the legislation that is now written by my friends on the other side of the aisle is telling the United States of America in conflict with the United States Supreme Court decision, and let me just hold up for visuals the Constitution, which is what this majority says that they are basing their whole legislative agenda on. Well, we have constitutional authority, and they are now telling us that we should not regulate water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur, hexafluoride, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and any other substance. I don't hear a scream and cry of the industry. I do hear the idea that there are burdens that will come upon the industry that we should address. And so the amendment that I have that I'm asking for real consideration on the basis of a national security question, how will we provide for resources that will provide for the engine economy of this community, of this nation? The long-term impacts of the Environmental Protection Agency having no authority to regulate emissions of greenhouse gases. Also, if there are alternatives to ensure compliance with the Clean Air Act, if you have a better alternative, and best practices with respect to greenhouse gas regulation under the Clean Air Act, which the Supreme Court decision clearly dictates that it has the authority to regulate it. But we need to collaborate and cooperate and understand how we balance the needs of an energy policy. Might I also say that energy recognizes all forms of energy, and energy companies that are in oil and gas are looking at alternatives. They have whole sections that are addressing the question of alternative fuels. Why are we raising a bill that has no sense of direction and what it's trying to do, and to eliminate an oversight that is protecting the American public and their quality of life, and also doesn't speak to how we work with the industry to actually make sure that we check these emissions, but as well provide the opportunity for domestic growth and domestic energy growth. So I would reserve the balance of my time, ask my colleagues to support this amendment.
Gentlelady reserves her time. Gentleman from Michigan. For what purposes? Gentleman from Michigan rise.
Mr. Chairman, I would yield myself the 5 minutes. And
Does the gentleman rise in opposition?
I rise in opposition as control of the time.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I just want to say to my friend from Texas that with regard to the hue and cry of folks that support this legislation, not a lot of business folks, I have a whole series of letters of support for our legislation, from the American Electric Power to the Farm Bureau, the Iron and Steel Institute, Americans for Tax Reform, American Public Power Association, Business Roundtable, Chamber of Commerce, Metal Casters Alliance, Multi-Traders Letter, Auto Dealers, Realtors, Manufacturers, National Association of Manufacturers, Cattlemen, Mining Association, Petrochemical, Rural Electric Cooperative, and on and on. I will ask unanimous consent that all of these letters be placed in the record, and I yield now to the gentleman from Texas.
Gentleman's request is covered by General Lee.
4 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank the distinguished my good friend from Houston, Texas amendment before I say something negative. If it were to pass, it would at least force the EPA to do a real study, which is more than I can say they did before they issued their endangerment finding. If you look at the endangerment finding that they actually did, that to satisfy the requirement of the Supreme Court, they didn't do any scientific analysis. They didn't do any independent analysis. They basically took regurgitated research and press clippings and apparently some student's thesis as the justification for coming up with their endangerment finding. If we accept the gentlelady from Houston's amendment, you do really gut this bill, which, if you're opposed to it, that's probably a good outcome, but if you're supportive of it, it's not a good outcome. We don't need to do a study. CO2 is not a pollutant under the definitions of the Clean Air Act. It's not harmful to health. As I keep pointing out, as I speak, I create CO2. And so you need CO2 for life. Man-made CO2 does not significantly contribute to climate change. We do have climate change, as we always have, and always will. But to say that CO2 emissions somehow are causing all these, made by man, are causing all these catastrophic changes is simply not true. And what the bill before us does is say we protect the Clean Air Act, we want to enforce the Clean Air Act, but we want it to be enforced for the criteria pollutants that it was intended, and we do not believe that CO2 is one of the pollutants that it was intended to regulate. So we don't need a study, and I would oppose my good friend from Houston's amendment and encourage all members to also oppose, and I will either reserve or yield back depending on the chairman's wish.
Why don't you yield back, and I'll yield the balance of our time, which is how long?
The gentleman from California has 2 minutes and 3/4.
I will yield the balance of our time to
2 minutes and 3/4.
yield the balance of my time to a gentleman from California, member of the committee, Mr. Bilbray.
I appreciate that. Let's talk science, ladies and gentlemen. Everyone wants to talk about the threat of climate change, but no one wants to address the fact that what EPA has proposed by the admission of the administrator cannot even indicate what percentage of greenhouse gases those regulations could reduce. And not one scientist, not one expert in our committee, or I have seen anywhere else, has ever said what is being proposed by EPA that is going to cost at least $200 million will not avoid the problem of climate change. So the question is this: what is the American people getting for their $200 million? Now, I'm sorry, some of us have worked on air pollution issues. I know the precursors to ozone. If they are saying that the problem is it's a precursor to ozone, believe me, it is so small and minute that those of us that are working in non-attainment areas never even gave a second glance at CO2. So don't talk about it being a health risk based on a precursor to ozone. Look at what we're getting for the money. What we are actually talking about here is not allowing EPA to go out and implement programs that the administrator admits that she cannot tell us what the American people are going to get for their dollars. If you want to do a study, then let's do a study on what would have to be done to address this issue a way that some of us think it should be addressed. But let's not say that somehow that by holding up a program that is admitted not to be able to deliver any tangible benefits, that holding up that program is some kind of would be a threat to public health. So let's just get back down to the real science, and that is no one in this establishment is talking about addressing the climate change issue. Some people are saying it doesn't exist, and others are trying to sell an environmental placebo that makes you look good because you're doing something, but spends huge amounts of money, has a great impact, and does not address the problem, will not avoid the problem. And one thing we've got to make clear, don't talk to me about incrementalism when we talk about climate change. You talk to the same scientists that you say are telling us about climate change, and they say if we don't get the job done within the next decade or two, forget about it. It's over with. The fact is climate change will happen, and sadly, what I've seen in the last 2 years about this issue, I've come to the conclusion this body really should be talking about what we need to do to mitigate the impact, because you're not doing anything to avoid it. And we shouldn't tell the American people that we are.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Texas.
May I ask the remaining time?
The gentlewoman has 1 minute remaining.
Okay, I'd like to yield 30 seconds to my good friend from
I just want to thank you very much. I just want to point out Mr. Barton, my very good friend, who used to be chairman of the committee and was ranking member when I asked him to work with us on a bipartisan energy policy. He said, I don't believe there is such a thing as global warming. It doesn't exist. It's not a problem. Why spend any money or effort to find a solution? And now, while the gentlelady's amendment is saying at least study what will happen if you don't do anything in this area, and he said that's not needed either. I think at least we ought to know what the gentlelady's suggesting, and that is what would be the long-term impact if we do nothing. I support the amendment.
I thank the distinguished gentleman for all of his work, and I come as a peacemaker, Madam Chairwoman. Houston, by the American Lung Association, is the 7th most ozone polluted cities in the nation. The Supreme Court clearly said under the Clean Air Act that it authorized the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases as it makes a judgment that it impacts on climate change. At the same time, there are industries that happen to be oil and gas that can sit down and benefit from a real study that will talk about best practices and also have the engagement that we need to have. It is reckless to talk about what scientists have said. The members are not scientists, and I believe you cannot rid the EPA of its jurisdiction, and I would ask my colleagues to be thoughtful along with the industry, and let's have a reasonable study. This impacts our national security. I ask my colleagues to support my amendment.
All time for debate has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Gentlewoman from Texas.
On that, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in House Report 112-54. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 2, printed in House Report Number 112-54, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 203, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, and a member opposed to each will control 5 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas.
I thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to take a slightly different perspective and ask my colleagues to support this amendment. Again, I am hoping, I know there are a lot of letters that my good friend from Michigan says that he has, and anytime you put forward legislation that trade groups send word out to membership and say this is going to save you a bucket full of money and you better jump on the bandwagon, and there's no alternative or there's no basis of understanding the underpinnings of what we're doing, then you get that kind of phrase. I hope that people who are with the industry, having practiced the law and have seen some of the mountains that all industries have to climb, I think we can find a reasonable way of functioning. I just want to put in the record that the industry, which is part of the drive of my friends on the other side, the oil and gas industry does generate 9,237 million jobs, $1 trillion contributed to the economy, $178 billion paid to the U.S. Treasury or to the government in rent, royalties, and bonus payments, and $95.6 billion in taxes, income taxes, $194 billion invested to improve the environmental performance of its products, and $58.4 billion amount invested in low and zero carbon emission technologies from 2000 to 2008. I encourage them to keep going. But the way that you keep going is not to eliminate the oversight body, but you work with it. And my amendment is very clear. I create a pathway for the industry to be engaged on any rulemaking. It should provide a notice period of no less than 30 days, specifically to the affected greenhouse gas producers. And this is a sort of a pipeline for the industry, proposed to be regulated and allow industry-specific comments to be submitted to the administrator, separate and apart from the public comment period, and to discuss the economic impact of the proposed regulation. Provide for an opportunity for the regulated industry to request receive a 60-day extension. And we should take into consideration the effect of the proposed regulation on greenhouse gas emissions. These companies have employees living in our community, and it is noted that Houston, the Houston area to Huntsville, has some of the largest pollutants in the air. The effect of the proposed regulation on energy production, the feasibility of the implementation of the regulation on the entities being regulated, the effect of the proposed regulation on the availability of energy to consumers, and the adverse environmental effects of delaying implementation of the proposed regulation. It allows a discussion that may not be at the level that we would like it today. I can't imagine, and I guess my friend on the other side of the aisle will come up and show me all the letters that he's saying that are supporting legislation that completely obliterates the opportunity for any governmental oversight. I disagree. I want to know the question of whether or not we have had the kinds of discussions that warrant a deliberative process and to bring about a concept of listening to industry and industry listening on the question of air pollutants. I hold up and I'd like unanimous consent to submit into record the Mayor's Task Force on the Health Effects of Air Pollution.
Lady's request is covered by General Lee.
I do understand, and thank you, but it talks about Houston. But I'm not going to narrow this to Houston. Wherever there are companies that are refineries, as they so discuss, we are not trying to undermine that work. But does anybody want to live in China with the air pollutants that they have? Let me just say that what we're addressing is a question of balance. My amendment provides input by the industry and the EPA collaborating on how this will impact going forward. I'd like you to support my amendment. I reserve my balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves the balance of her time. Does the gentleman from Kentucky seek the time in opposition?
Yes, I do.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I would like to yield as much time as he may consume to Mr. Shimkus of Illinois, the chairman of the Environment and Economy Subcommittee.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to thank my colleague from Kentucky for the time and appreciate this opportunity to really talk about this. And I rise reluctantly to oppose my friend from Houston. I know she has a lot of her constituents who work in the fossil fuel industry and the refining industry and the refinery section, but parts of the amendment do some disastrous things to the bill. First of all, it strikes most of the base text. We're here today, and I understand her position of wanting industry to listen. We want EPA to listen. That's the whole debate. Why we're down here is we want EPA to listen. And so as we address this debate, her amendment would strike most of the base text, and the whole reason why we're here is to get the attention of the EPA and respond to the people who sent us here to do not hurt and harm job creation. My friend, the ranking member Waxman and Markey, their bill did not pass the legislative process. It didn't go through both chambers, did not get signed by the President. Why? Because we understood what would have happened. We successfully argued the debate that energy costs go up. If you price carbon, you raise the cost of electricity. If you price carbon, you raise the cost of manufacturing. If you price carbon, you raise the cost of gasoline. Now, in this recessionary economy, do we want to do that? And do we want to give the Environmental Protection Agency the sole authority without us doing the process that I think the legislation process allows us to do, to talk about the winners and the losers, the give and take? What was decided in the last Congress was the legislative process could not pass this because it was too controversial and it would affect jobs. It would affect jobs. And this is what we're all concerned about. The last round of Clean Air Acts, which are really, you could really talk about toxic emittance, cost thousands of jobs in Southern Illinois, cost thousands of jobs in Kentucky, cost thousands of jobs in Ohio Valley. And if, again, you go back to the basic premise, if you price carbon. So what my colleague's amendment does, it says, let's keep the EPA pricing an emittant that is not toxic. Carbon dioxide is not a toxic emittant. It's not nitrous oxide, it's not sulfur dioxide, it's not a particulate matter, it's not a criteria pollutant under the EPA and the Clean Air Act. So we're saying, don't regulate emittants that aren't toxic. Don't put a price on carbon that will cost jobs. So that's why we need to reject this. Now, in debates of the other amendments, this isn't the only attack on the fossil fuel industry. Greenhouse gas is just one rule coming down. Then we have boiler MAC. We've got mercury MAC. We've got cooling towers. We've got coal ash. We've got the transport rule. All separate rules, and these will affect the refining industry. Most of these regulations are new regulations coming down from the EPA to destroy the fossil fuel sector that raises costs and destroys jobs. So my colleague's amendment, what it does is it doesn't change the reason why we're here. The reason why we're here is saying, EPA, stop. If it's a good enough policy, it can pass the legislative body. But you know what? It wasn't a good enough policy to pass a Democrat-controlled Senate. And it wasn't good enough policy to get a bill to the President to sign into law. So why is it a good policy to let unelected bureaucrats in the Environmental Protection Agency move on a process to destroy jobs? Let's be held accountable. If we want to do that, let's cast our votes. What we're casting our votes today is to keep the cost of power low and save jobs, create jobs, and grow jobs. If you want job creation, we support the underlying bill. We do not support any amendment that puts off telling the EPA to stop and desist and do no more. Again, the basic premise of the climate debate is putting a price on a carbon emission that is not toxic. And by putting a price on there, you raise the cost of energy that everybody uses. You raise the cost of home heating, automobiles, electricity, and the like. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Texas.
May I ask the remaining time?
Gentlewoman has 1 minute remaining.
Okay. obviously, time on the other side?
The time has expired on the other side.
Can I give my ranking member 15 seconds?
Well, thank you for yielding to me. This bill, the EPA does not put a price on carbon. The EPA is not setting up a cap-and-trade program. The EPA is only saying in new facilities with large amounts of carbon emissions, put in efficiency standards so that you can reduce those emissions. That's all.
I thank the gentleman. You know, my friend from Illinois, have I got an amendment for you? I am answering your concern. And in just a moment, Madam, all their time is expired. Is that correct?
That is correct.
I have an amendment. My amendment says it requires that before finalizing emission regulations on greenhouse gas producers, the EPA must provide the producer with adequate notice of at least 30 days. The provision would also allow for industry input, encouraging collaboration between EPA and energy providers during the regulation process. Currently, the EPA does not have a minimum time requirement. It also gives another 60-day extension. This is about national security, because air pollutants and then no energy, bad on one side and bad on the other. Let's get together, because we can't dismiss any of these energy sources, but they need to be better. And how can we, since this is supposed to be the Supreme Court Constitution side, how can you dismiss the constitutional right that EPA has to regulate? I ask my colleagues to support this amendment. This is an amendment for them.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. All time for debate has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the gentlewoman from Texas.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas will be postponed. It's now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report 11254. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Madam Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in House Report number 112-54, offered by Mr. McNerney of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 203, the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Madam Speaker, I rise to offer an amendment to H.R. 910. Let's be crystal clear about two things. The bill we are considering today, which I will call the Dirty Air Act, is an attack on science. It's bad policy that will harm the American people. The world's scientific experts overwhelmingly agree that climate change is happening. It's primarily caused by human activities, and it has harmful consequences. However, despite our disagreements about the merits of H.R. 910, I am offering an amendment that I think we can all support. My amendment is pro-environment, pro-consumer, and pro-business to make sure that our country can continue to administer voluntary programs to reduce pollution, improve public health, and address climate change. The gentleman yields to the gentleman from Michigan for a comment.
If the gentleman will yield, we're prepared to accept the amendment. If we could,
I will accept that.
We're prepared to accept it on.
Amendments agreed to.
So,
does the gentleman from California yield back?
The gentleman yields.
Gentleman yields back.
Yield back.
Questions on the amendment from the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 4, printed in House Report 112-54. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in House Report number 112-54, offered by Mr. Cuellar of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 203, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cuellar, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to encourage my colleagues to support my amendment. The intent of my amendment is quite narrow. This amendment makes the underlying legislation a question of authority, not a question of science. The amendment strikes the finding of the language from the particular bill. This ensures that H.R. 910 is only about Article 1 of the Constitution, giving the U.S. Congress the right to say whether EPA can or cannot regulate greenhouse gas. Also, the amendment preserves the authority of the agency to improve the efficiency of automobiles and light trucks, an issue which there is widespread agreement. While H.R. 910 intends to exempt auto standards, the legislation would stop the EPA from improving on any future car efficiency standards. This amendment does not remove any enforcement power the EPA has previously exercised since the enactment of the Clean Air Act. At the same time, this amendment does not authorize new regulatory initiatives beyond what the agency has done for decades. For example, the agency is in no way authorized by the amendment to undertake low-carbon fuel standards or new emission guidelines or permitting obligations for stationary sources. Finally, my amendment refines the definition of H.R. 910 by removing water vapor. This is consistent with the legislation we have considered in the past of what is and isn't greenhouse gas. Water vapor is not a long-term harmful warming cause. In short, this amendment makes the underlying legislation a question of the EPA's authority granted under the Clean Air Act. Madam Speaker, I thank you for the consideration of this amendment. I urge all my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment, and I thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Does the gentleman from Texas seek